Hey, yo, it's me, Pops Van Marmalade, and you're watching the Comics-Related Madness Network. Huh? So come get some. CromCon. CromCon.
Entertainment Group presents the Madness Comic Network with original programming and additional comic-related content.
Hey, we want to shout out to our sponsors, Daytona Beach Comic Con. If you are a fan of comic books, if you're a fan of comic book conventions, and if you like meeting comic book creators and getting comics and comic-related stuff, then you need to make your plans to attend Daytona Beach Comic Con. This year's show is September 7th and 8th. Silverline will be there, so you should make your plans to be there too. We'll see you there. If you like comics and find yourself in the Orlando, Florida area, doesn't everyone come to Orlando at some point in time to see the House of Mouse? But when you're here, you need to make it a point to visit Coliseum of Comics, especially the one on East Colonial Drive. They carry Silverline comics, even a limited edition Coliseum of Comics version of our comics. So, when you go, be sure to ask for Silverline Comics and tell them we sent you. OCD stands for Orlando Collector Deviants. OCD, Steve and Trish, they're a family of geeks who promote geek things, particularly those around the Orlando, Florida area. They're big supporters of Silverline, and we think you should be supporters of theirs too. Go give them some love. If you are an independent comic book maker and you need to get your independent comics made, you need to look no further than Kablam Digital Printing. They print our books, and they do a bang-up job. They're not only trusted by Silverline, but many, many independent comic book makers. Head on over to kablam.com and see for yourself just how easy it is to have your comic printed by them. And tell them Silverline sent you.
Hi, this is Tim TK, host of That Silverline Show on Tuesday. Join us at 11 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Pacific every Tuesday night as we discuss pop culture and the joys of making comics.
Hi, I'm Barb Kilber, co-host of Silverline's Wednesday Wham. Join us each Wednesday nights as we discuss comics, literature, movies, and anything else that may catch our attention.
I'm Roland Mann, and I host Silverline's Silver Sunday. Join me every Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern as we make mine Silverline.
Ladies and gentlemen, comic book and storytelling fans across the universe, this is Silverline's Wednesday Wham show, and I'm going to jump right in it. We are joined tonight by Mr. Kevin Vanhook, artist, comic book writer, and a prolific storyteller. And we are going to roll right in because I want to spend as much time as we can with this fine gentleman. First of all, we're humbled. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Barb, for making this connection. And we've got folks out there who love to learn. We love to learn on this show, and we want to learn everything we can about you. And I am going to give you as much time as you'd like to talk. If you want to spend the whole hour and a half talking, we would love to listen. We have some questions. We want to learn about your career. We want to learn about the ins and outs of being in the industry, about creating comic books, about being in the film industry, about writing, about arting, and all those things that are associated with creating amazing stories. So before I forget, Silverline is brought to you by the Daytona Beach Comic Convention. So thank you to all those folks at the convention and for supporting Silverline and supporting us. And we've got a great crew of people that are going to be there in September. So if you're anywhere near the United States of America, North America, or this hemisphere, we would love for you to come to Orlando and say hello. We've got a great crew. And then this weekend, Mr. Rory Boyle and I, Roland, as well, we will be in Pittsburgh for the Three Rivers Comic-Con. And thank you to those folks for having us there. We will have a Silverline table set up with all of our stories ready to be purchased and signed by some of the artists. So join us if you can. Mr. Vanhook, thank you for being here. I would love for you to get started. Start wherever you would like chronologically, how you got into comic books or storytelling, and then give us a timeline of how that morphed into your career as it is right now.
Well, I've been at it for a while, so I'll try to not give you every boring detail. But I, as a kid, I was reading comics. I actually, believe it or not, one of the very first comic books I ever picked up was Swamp Thing with Batman in it. So it was Bernie Wrightson's, I believe it's Swamp Thing 7. I would screw it up, but I think that's right. And I was 8 years old, and I knew it just looked cool. And then my mom, so I bought a few books around that time, local convenience store. This is right at the edge of 20-25 cent cover prices. And I remember one of the very first books I looked at was A Werewolf by Night, written by Marv Wolfman. So it made the comment that, a Wolfman writing a werewolf, or a werewolf written by Wolfman.
I have a piece of original art I should show you from that.
Oh yeah, that's awesome.
Ooh, cool.
And so I love this stuff, and then didn't really. We moved out in the country. It wasn't really easy to get comic books. I would go if my mom had a doctor's appointment or something. I'd go to a drugstore and that kind of thing. And but a buddy of my brother's in high school lent him a year run of the Fantastic Four, and it was the 160s, 170s. So it was a lot of George Perez and Rich Buckler and that kind of stuff, and I just fell in love with that. And then we moved to Detroit, where I'd lived a little bit, and this having moved from Kentucky and Indiana, and so in Detroit, I got the nerve to go out to a real comic book store and went to Comic Kingdom, and that became a weekly thing. And so I would buy comic books, and I would talk to other people who were into them, and I collected, and I put them in little plastic bags and did all the stuff that kids start doing when they collect comics. And I would convince one of my buddies to ride the bus with me because it was 2 city buses to get out there. And it was Detroit, and I was 12. But,
oh wow! Yeah.
Of course, looking back on it, I Fearless had no concerns whatsoever.
I was gonna say, what year was that?
But we, I did that, and then when I was 14, I got to meet Keith Pollard and Arvell Jones and Aubrey Bradford and Mike Vosberg at a comic book convention put on by a couple of kids that I knew who were like 16 years old. And
Wow.
One was a guy named Brent Carpenter, and the other one was Alan Oldham. And actually went to high school with Brent, although he was a year or two older than me, a couple of years older than me. But I always felt like I went to school with Alan because I would always see him together, but he went somewhere else. And but his path and mine crossed a lot more over the years. Both of us ended up working for different comic book companies, the same comic book companies at different times. And so we both ended up doing stuff at Caliber Press and Innovation and Amazing and stuff like that. So met those guys, got influenced. I was definitely bitten by the bug, showed them my stuff, got some feedback. Keith Pollard was kind enough to ask me if I'd considered a job in plumbing by any chance. I still give him grief for that.
I got a lot of stuff like that too when I first started out 30 years ago.
We all did.
He was actually very nice, but that was his sense of humor. And but 3 years later, I was working. So I was working at Pacific Comics when I was 17 and drawing. And I had met Roger McKenzie, also at a comic book convention. Roger became a good friend and a mentor. And he helped me get work at Pacific. And then I did stuff for Eclipse. And I had a habit of working for companies that went out of business very quickly in the 80s. And then did my own book called Jack Frost for Amazing Comics that I wrote and drew. And a book with Roger called Ninja Bots. Because if ninjas are popular and robots are popular, ninja robots are really popular.
Double.
Oh, I thought you said ninja butts.
That's a different. Probably popular.
That's my comic, Barbara. You know that.
Yeah, I'll draw an issue. those sneaky ninja butts. So I did stuff for Amazing, and then they went away. And then I helped David Campetti form Innovation Publishing. I was the original production manager and art director. And
you were probably my art director then at one point.
I left fairly quickly. Dave and I were good friends, and in order to maintain that, I had to quit.
Okay.
So I stayed probably less than 6 months from the time we started the company. So from like November till
I was there well
maybe 5 months, like March. So, and but I was reverse engineering a color separation method that Bill Dubé and Michelle Wrightson and trying to think what her name was, but it was Bill Dubé's wife as well. Had worked on with Richard Corbin back at Warren, and it was painting in shades of gray on acetate and shooting halftones to make color separations. And they had done a system where they had done this literally with one shade, one value per piece of acetate. So meaning if you're trying to represent 25% gray, you'll do a light gray, and that's that one overlay. And now you do a 50% gray, and that's that overlay. So if you knew anything about CMYK color, it was made up of various percentages of cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And we were basically approximating Kamiko's color palette, another comic book company I did a little bit of stuff for that they before they went away again. I had a whole host of books that I was either in the middle of or finished before that didn't see the light of day. But anyway, I did this color separation thing, and I continued to do that for Innovation from my home studio, and then did some stuff for Dark Horse and some other companies. And then I became the art director and production manager for Caliber Press. And while there, I wrote and drew the Rocky Horror Picture Show and the adaptation. And I did. They published my new adventures of my Jack Frost character in two different series called Frost. One was a mini series called Frost: The Dying Breed. And unfortunately, the Gulf War broke out, and Gary came to me and said that he didn't think it made sense for us to print the fourth issue of 4. And because it was a losing money proposition because his sales were just tanking. And so there are 3 of those 4 issues in print. And so at least I was doing better. And then I went back into graphic design for about a year, and then decided to send off samples to Valiant Comics, Marvel, and DC. And I had some stuff going with DC as a writer. And I called to follow up on my samples at Valiant, and I reached Jim Shooter, and he told me, Kevin, we receive hundreds, if not thousands, of submissions every week, and there's no way that I would know, which one of these in this massive mountain of submission envelopes is yours. And I said, mine's a 9x12 black envelope. There's a 9x12 black envelope here. Hang on. Yeah, that's you. Okay. All right.
Wow.
Well, you're pretty good. You're too flashy for me, but you're pretty good. I don't really have anything for you right now, but great work, and keep it up. And I said, well, if you ever need anybody that has a strong print and pre-press background and knows their way around Macs and desktop publishing, that's what I do for my day job. And he said, let me put you on with my buddy Bob. And Bob Layton got on the phone, and we talked. And without telling you all the details, it boiled down to him saying, if you can do everything you say you can do, I'll hire you. And me saying, make room for my desk, because I ain't bluffing.
Oh, boy.
I actually ended up literally borrowing $400 from my sister and taking Greyhound to New York, and interviewed and asked for X amount, and they gave me 2,000 or 3,000 more, and for a year, and then paid to move my wife and 2 little boys out there. And we found a place in Jersey City. At Innovation, I'd become friends with a fellow named Paul Kurtis, and Paul is Maggie Thompson's brother.
Mhm.
Yeah.
The
Yeah,
comic
yeah.
character.
Maggie's a good friend. We're both Wisconsinites.
Say it one more time.
I said Maggie's a good friend. We're both Wisconsinites here.
Oh, very nice. Yeah, I've always thought the world of all of them, but of Maggie as well.
The
But
Thompsons,
Paul was living in New York and working for Carol Kalish.
Yep.
Had been working for Carol Kalish at that time, and I don't have my timing exactly right when she passed, but I think this is just after she passed. But he was kind enough to let me stay over, and we went and got a newspaper, and I found an apartment. And 2 weeks later, my wife and little boys and I were living in Jersey City, and from Indianapolis, which was quite a culture shock for less
Boy,
so
I'll
for me
bet.
because I lived in Detroit, but so I'd lived in a big city that was a metropolitan place. But she was largely we'd lived in Kentucky and Wheeling, West Virginia area for Innovation.
I was born in Wheeling.
Where you?
I love Wheeling. Yeah.
Yeah, David Campetti's from Moundsville. Our office was on Jackson Street.
Who's from Moundsville?
David Campetti.
David Campetti.
Innovation, and
that's where I have my family reunion at Grandview
Yeah.
Park every year.
Wow.
I've been there. We actually technically lived in
world.
St. Clairsville, right over the river.
That's Ohio there. Yeah.
Which ticked off the Chamber of Commerce of Wheeling because they were partially funding innovation. And it wasn't explained to me that part of what they're trying to do is bring money into that city. And I moved there and I thought, well, I'd much rather live over here.
They got a mall over there.
They had a mall over that was actually that. And that's where I saw Batman in 1989 on my birthday.
Wow.
But yeah, it was definitely a ride. So at Valiant, I worked with Shooter for about 3 months, and then he was let go. There were some machinations within the company and multiple sides to the story, but the bottom line is he was no longer part of the company, and I had been starting to co-write with him, and I ended up inheriting those titles. And then a few months later, I developed Bloodshot, and so arrived there March 28th, and on November 17th, Bloodshot 1 came out. And so in a very, very short amount of time, it went from taking the Greyhound bus into creating a comic book that sold 1 million copies. So it was a whirlwind.
So after 20 years of working, you were an overnight success.
After 10 years, literally, I was 26. Turned 27 that year.
Isn't that the way it usually works?
Well, that's what I always said, and it was so funny because that was something that Steve Mazarski, the publisher, liked to say, was that I was a homegrown overnight success, and I'm like, I've literally been at this for 10 years. But because I had been at it, I had a skill set. So I knew a lot about printing, I knew a lot about pre-press and design, and so I was a production manager. But I also was a creator, and so I was helping ink books. I got to help ink Ditko on some stuff, and which was cool. I got to meet Ditko. They had a, Valiant was a great time for me, and for a lot of us. I mean, it was my timing was great for once in my life. I got there when they were starting to do a little better than they had been, selling maybe 40,000 copies of something, and 25,000 on average, to within a year, our average sales were like 400,000 and 500,000, which was just insane. And then so we had a lot of good people there, a lot of good creators and good marketing people, and they did stuff like Grown Ups, in my mind, which was like they were selling real ads. So we had Acclaim and video game company and places like that advertising with us and paying real money, and so
yes, real money is
not
always
exchanging.
Well, it's
just
one of
for
the
that.
things that traditionally, most comic book companies I've been a part of never had anything but house ads, really. So it was at Innovation or Caliber or Amazing, any of those places, it was really just ads for our other books. It wasn't. We treated it. We had an ad agency sales guy who went and met with ad agencies, and so we had Upper Deck and these places that wanted to have eyeballs on their product.
That's a smart move.
Yeah.
It was very smart, and they were doing that before I got there. I was just very impressed. My biggest contribution to them, besides being a creative person, was organization, because when I got there, they just really it had grown very organically, and so there wasn't just some of the basic things you needed to do to organize producing 8 books a month. And so we went from a great big flat file cabinet to an individual flat file cabinet for every title that had script, letters, pencils, inks, colors, and so forth, and as opposed to 5 drawers that everything goes in. And that was a big deal. It was just an enormous deal. It was a big deal that nobody till that point was keeping a checklist. And so they would have weekly meetings, and you'd hear Fred Pierce, who's now the head of the current Valiant, who was our operations manager, our office operations manager, and he handled production, getting things printed and so forth, who would say, so where do we stand on Harbinger 7, the current issue? And Bob would go, it's like, we're good. Yeah, we're good. And Fred would go, yeah, Bob, what does that mean? And he's like, well, what do you mean? Well, how many pages are penciled? Let's just start with that. And so then once I was there, I had my little notebook, which today would be a spreadsheet, but it was essentially a check mark besides page 1 with pencil, or a date. So we knew when
this is something I always pound relentlessly to wannabe comic book artists, that they have to keep in mind that first, comics is a business, and you have to run it like a business. And if you aren't organized and think in a business sense, you're never going to succeed.
No, it's like anything else. You have to look at it and say, what is the goal here? Is the goal that I'm creating a vanity press piece that I just want to do because I want to do it, in which case I don't care if it takes me a year to produce the first issue or whatever, and the next one might take a year or 2, then that's okay. But if you're doing it as a ongoing financial concern with the idea of making money and doing more of it and employing other people and becoming somebody who actually has the respect of distributors and retailers and other creators, you have to treat it like a business.
Very much so.
Kevin, I wanted to back up just a little. I'm sorry. When you got your foot in
but I'm only to 1992.
Okay. Put a pin there. This is some storytelling. We're going to flash back. When you got your foot in the door, was that as a writer, as a penciler or inker? What got you noticed first, and then penciling? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So initially, I was known as a penciler, and it really wasn't until so. In 1986, when I created Jack Frost, my thing had been, hey, nobody's writing stuff for me to draw. And it's like, I'm just waiting around for this stuff. And it's like, and I'd always admired Frank Miller specifically I felt that Frank was a brilliant writer and a brilliant storyteller and a pretty good draftsman. Meaning I didn't love his drawing as much as I did the emotional aspect of what he did and the storytelling aspect of what he did, but, as opposed to his anatomy and that kind of thing, where I looked at people like Gene Colan with his beautiful lighting and drama, and Gene Day and Paul Gulacy with their realism and cinematic storytelling and that kind of thing. But Miller was this wonderful hybrid of somebody who could write and draw. And so I kind of wanted to be him in that sense. And initially I was heavily influenced by Al Williamson. I left this out, but when I was 19, I moved to Holmesdale, Pennsylvania to be Al Williamson's assistant.
Ooh.
And I got there and we'd already made the deal. And sadly, my wife and I had just lost a little baby. She had lived only a day. And so we were kind of starting over in that sense as well. And we were very young. We'd gotten married extremely young. And we got there, and the week that Star Wars was canceled, his strip. And so he couldn't use me as an assistant, and he was trying to find work himself. And he had thought the whole time that week or so prior that they're not going to really cancel it. And so he thought I would have had work. And so he didn't tell me, hey, don't move out here. And he was very kind and very generous with his time. And he sat with me and went over some stuff and that kind of thing. But I ended up doing highlights for children illustrations because it just happened to be that their editorial office was in that little town. And my wife and I were walking down Church Street because it was as close as I felt like going to a church at that point. And I saw a sign on the side of this Victorian house that said highlights for children, and went in, and turned out that was really where they did hidden picture puzzles and stuff like that. And so I did that for a little bit. And but I drew, and so it wasn't until '86 that I took myself seriously as a writer as well. And Roger McKenzie, to be fair, he had encouraged me because he felt I was writing as good as he felt my writing was ready. And so he was pushing me to LA Syndicate, who he was doing some comic strips for, and he was pushing me to Pacific to write. And when we got the deal, I should clarify the Dave Campetti connection. So Roger did a book called Sunrunners with Pat Broderick for Pacific, and that was packaged by David Campetti and Associates. And David from Wheeling, from his office in Wheeling, he was at a Chicago Comic Con in '86, and I met him. And I took his stuff. And he said, I had three offers that weekend to publish Jack Frost. So I had a company called Hot Comics. And, Joe Jack. And I had Amazing. And I'm trying to remember who the other one was. It was somebody that didn't last. But I went with Dave and got home. And then he called me and said, if you can get me a finished cover for Jack Frost 1 by Monday morning, FedEx, I'll have it solicited, and we're going to bring it out through Sirius Comics was the idea. Juan Collado. And then he called like an hour later and said, and if you can get me another cover for Ninja
You're doing a good imitation of him, by the way.
Thank you. I can actually do it a little better, but I'm pulling back because he might see this. And
we won't tell.
But he said if I could get him another one and do Ninja Bots, he would get that solicited too. So I did 2 covers over the weekend, FedExed them out, and they were solicited. But at the last minute, he made a deal with Scott Rosenberg, who was publishing, who wanted to publish and was starting Amazing Comics, and so that's what ended up happening. Was we came out from Amazing. Scott started Amazing and Wonder, and he owned comic book distribution companies, Sunrise and American Distribution, and then there was a lot of machinations and melodrama a few months later, and they briefly started up another venture, and then it just kind of all died. And then that was my mid '80s experience in a nutshell. But
I was at that same Comic Con.
Say it again, please.
I was at that same.
I know.
That was my first Chicago Comic Con.
Yeah, we met at that
'86.
Yeah. No, I remember. I wanted to ask you too, if you knew do you know an entertainment lawyer named William Ramsey? Bill
Do
Ramsey?
I?
Mm-hmm.
The name sounds familiar, but I don't know him.
Okay.
So
no, just
I don't know where I would know it from. No.
No, a few years ago, I ran into him on some business, and he saying that I had done comic books. He had said he had mentioned your name, and just hadn't thought about it till I saw you.
I hope that's good.
Does he owe you money? Oh, money, Rob?
But I don't know.
No,
I didn't have any money then, so I don't know. But it's possible I did meet him, and it's just that's '86. How long ago is that? You know, or that era? And if I saw a picture of him, I might go, "Oh, yeah, that guy."
No, this conversation was with the lawyer was somebody that I was working with about 5 or 6 years ago. But,
okay.
But yeah, I just but during that period, I started writing more, and so even though Roger was listed as the writer on Ninja Bots, he kind of deferred to me to actually just write a lot of it, and he just sort of edited and tweaked because
there you go.
I ended up doing a lot of stuff with Japanese mythology and stuff, and it wasn't his bag, and I was real into ninjutsu and
oh, you and Aaron would get along with the Japanese mythology. He loves that.
So we still have our pin in 1991, but what do you enjoy? So the version here, writing, drawing, do they both share the same space in your heart, or do you does one come more naturally to you? Is one easier or more enjoyable?
I love drawing. For me, drawing, when I'm at my best, it takes every fiber of my being. And for me to write comes naturally. So in 92, when I got to Valiant, and then, it became clear that I could draw and I could ink, and I was offered a book at Marvel, and Valiant had an understandable, very clear edict that if I was on staff or anybody was on staff, we couldn't be freelancing for the competition. And I got that. I understood that. So it was really weird for me to actually call up an editor at Marvel and say, I can't do this. I can't do this. But after years of trying to get in the door. But I was writing Flash Gordon. So what happened was I had done samples for King Features to draw Secret Agent Corrigan, which was Al Williamson's old strip that was created by Alex Raymond. And he and Archie had done it for 13 years. And that's what led into him doing Star Wars with Archie. And they loved the samples and they wanted me to do it. And then they talked to George Evans, and George decided he didn't want to retire. George was an EC Comics guy. He was a brilliant artist who, at that point, was actually still drawing the strip. And at that point, I believe, so basically that was the deal there. So I got a call from King Features saying, I can't give you a strip to draw, but how do you feel about writing another one of the Raymond strips? And I said, sure. And it was Flash Gordon. And I ended up writing the Sunday strip for a couple of years.
Wow.
Until Valiant said, it doesn't look good for you to be writing stuff for other people. I said, they're a newspaper thing. And they gave me grief. And at that point, I had enough clout that I said, well, up my page rate enough that it makes a difference for me to give it up, and I'll quit. So but it was a fascinating time. I loved writing the strip, but I have to admit, writing 3 books a month minimum and a comic strip, and being the executive editor and vice president of the company, and having 2 little kids and a wife, that it was a little wacky.
It's a lot of flaming chainsaws to juggle.
One more time.
A lot of flaming chainsaws to juggle.
It was just a sense of I mean, I've always been good at multitasking, but it was one of those things where I found myself starting to do a split schedule. So I would come home, have dinner, spend time with the wife and kids, go to bed at like 9 when the kids went to sleep, and then wake up at 3 a.m. and write for 2 or 3 hours, and then go back to sleep. Yeah. And that worked great until I sat there, and at the time I was writing Eternal Warrior, Bloodshot, and Solar Man of the Atom, and Flash Gordon. And I just started writing, and I remember distinctly saying, page 17, panel 1, long horizontal panel, we see Eternal Warrior walk in the door, and there is Flash Gordon. I realized I have to back off a little bit or slow down. But or my stories are going to stop making sense.
Yeah.
But I ended up, because I was writing a lot of stuff, and then Acclaim Entertainment, which was our client who'd been buying advertising, decided that they would rather buy our company. They bought Valiant, and for $65 million, and that was a good point for me to kind of say, I think I want to go teach myself how to make movies. And I made a deal with Valiant to write exclusively for them for 2 years. So I knew I had an income. And my wife was a colorist, and I had developed digital coloring for them and digital lettering. We did the first fonts and stuff at that time, digital fonts that were commonly being used. We actually used them on regular production books. And we did digital coloring. And so I left, and we moved to San Diego and started my own company called Vanhook Studios. And we did a lot of comic book coloring and trading card packaging design. And because I had become very familiar with the printing process for Chromium, which was what we did for Bloodshot 1 and a bunch of our books, my studio specialized in Chromium print and prepress. And so we did lots and lots of comic book covers and trading cards and toy packaging and stuff like that for a few years. And all the while with me teaching myself how to make movies and do visual effects.
We're going to break in right here for some comments. Aaron, do you want to share the comments?
Oh, they're actually people. I'm sorry. I was usually it makes a sound. It does not make a sound. I'm sorry.
Kevin is a cool dude.
Yeah.
I know this cover he's talking about.
I got an Eternal Warrior Hulk 181 homage cover from him last year.
Very cool.
Oh, very cool.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Southern Comic Geek.
So I keep my hand in drawing. Over the years, mostly my drawing, it tends to be storyboarding. So I storyboarded movies like The 13th Warrior, and I did a lot of stuff for, oddly enough, for Discovery Channel and for Disney pilots and for Fox pilots when I first got into the business. But but what I do today is I do commissions, and so and especially when the Bloodshot, in that time running up to the Bloodshot movie coming out, there was a lot of Bloodshot sketches. A lot of people wanting an original sketch.
Oh yeah, no doubt.
That kind of stuff.
Yeah. Wasn't Bloodshot wasn't ever like a ninja? Wasn't there one that was like it was called Rye?
Yeah. So what happened was originally there was a book called Rye, and that was set in the future. And so when we created Bloodshot, the idea was a backstory that character Rye actually has the blood of heroes within him that actually originated in this guy back in our time period.
Okay, because I remember they both had the sort of white skin and the red dots.
Yeah,
I remember they looked like there's some sort of connection. I read some of the stuff. I did read some Bloodshot. I think Ninjak. I read some of that stuff. Yeah.
I also co-created Ninjak.
Oh, did you really? Yeah, I like Ninjak. I like the Bloodshot. Yeah.
Yeah, Rye was. I think they were all written by Jim Shooter. But he had started and Bob wrote, and I had a very tiny hand in a book called Rye Zero, which was our. It's a really kind of cool book. It's a white cover with a red circle and a black silhouette of Rye standing. You think it's Rye standing there. It's actually Bloodshot.
Okay.
And that what was cool about that comic book was it laid out the timeline of everything that's going to happen between now and 4400. So it laid out that there will be this character named Bloodshot, and this is what he will be, and there will be this character named that Shadow Man will die in 1999, and that Sting from Harbinger, one of our books, will disappear in 2029. So all this stuff was stated, and we saw these little moments, these little panels, and of course Bob and I are sitting around going, it's like, so what happens there? I don't know.
Yeah, we're making up as we go along. We know something happens when we get into it.
And so what was cool when I created a book called The Visitor, which I was really proud of, that Bernard Chang did with me, and John Ross, we did 2 issues a month, and they alternated. The Visitor, the punchline to it was that this character who seemed to be more powerful than any of our Valiant characters, and he was the original 2-issue introduction to him was drawn by Brian Hitch, which is just beautiful stuff that he did called Visitor versus the Valiant Universe, long before Authority and all that kind of stuff, or the Ultimates. But but the punchline was that this character that we think is an alien Superman with bug eyes and all this and 3 fingers is really this character from Harbinger. He's really Pete Stanchek from Harbinger, but it wasn't where he went when he disappeared in 2029. It's when he went, and so he'd gone back into our timeline, and then that was, and this is him as an old man who's been through hell. So.
That sounds cool. Yeah, I remember. Go ahead. I remember the Valiant stuff being very tightly woven together. I remember as storytelling, it was always something I felt like, and maybe this came from Jim Shooter, but I felt like there was a lot more story there. Something to sink my teeth.
I will never take away anything that Jim brought to the table. Jim did a lot of the foundation of the books for sure.
Yeah.
Created a lot of the stuff. Jim and I didn't see each other for almost 30 years, and then saw each other about 2 months ago.
Oh, nice.
And we got to be reunited at a convention. It's always fascinating to me because for me, it was a very seminal part of my life because I was being taken seriously as a creator and writer and so forth. and I was curious, when we did get reunited, is he going to feel upset with me that I'd stayed behind and he was kind of let go from the company, and I'd had a lot of success undeniably coming out of that, that situation, because I ended up writing those books. I didn't have to worry about that because he actually didn't remember me.
I was going to ask if he remembered, because that's long enough ago. Yeah,
it is 30 years.
Ouch.
And the thing is, once we started talking, once I was telling him about stories, about specific moments, he would remember. It's just he just didn't realize that was me, and he remembered an event. For instance, without going into any details, but the time I met Ditko, so he and Ditko were friends, and he remembered me describing how that all went down. But at any rate, it was. But it turned out, somebody did the math. I ended up writing 115, I think, of the 200 books that came out in the 2 years following Jim's departure. So
Jeez.
it was a lot.
Southern Comic Geek says, was it intentional to rare the gloss and the matte versions of Rise Zero, or an accident in printing?
When we got the first batch of Rise Zero books in, there was black smudging on the initial prints.
Oh man!
On a white book, and so the solution was to do a talcum powder pass in between. I'm simplifying, but it's basically talcum powder pass in between laying down each cover, and in the binding process. And in that process, about halfway through, I think somewhere in the middle, they realized that it was better to do that it seemed to get less scuffed on the glossy paper. And so it's a mix of different kinds of cover stock.
Yeah, on the coated paper.
Okay. So because of that, the matte version became much more rare?
If I remember right, yes. That's the more rare one. I've signed a lot of them. I even did very elaborate remarks, because it's got that red circle behind the figure, and so I'll put a big bloodshot overlooking him, in the circle. It's kind of cool. But yeah, that's my recollection anyway.
Kevin, speaking of colors, you mentioned at the beginning you were mixing color palettes. Is my understanding correctly that each studio has a proprietary palette that they use, or is it a palette for each comic?
Here's what the deal was. So back when I was a little boy, comic books were primarily printed with 64 colors, and so it was you essentially had colors that would make up what we call white person's flesh tone. You would have colors that would be really saturated, like Superman's cape, which is the same color that is Spider-Man's red costume. Superman's blue is the same as Spider-Man's blue on his costume. For instance, there was the brown that would be brown hair, which is the same that would be used for African-American people's skin, that kind of stuff. So there's a set number of colors, and those are mixed by, or achieved by mixing percentages of yellow ink, magenta ink, cyan ink, and that's it. And then for the covers, they would do things like add black. And so if you look at covers, and especially in the 70s, you would see, if you really look at them, like old Tomb of Dracula covers or something, the regular comic book series, you'll see that there's almost a painterly feel to it. And that's because those were actually done closer to the process I'm talking about, where they're actually painting a variable shade of gray to represent the magenta, and a variable shade of gray to represent the blue, and so forth. And they would add black, and the black would give this richness. Well, in the mid to late 80s, Kamiko decided, well, we're printing on better paper, we can have another level of color in here. So instead of just having quarter tones, half tones, and 100%, we could have 3/4 tones. And so they add 75% values. And these would be, you might see them sometime, they're called, I think the most common term would be color markups, but it's basically somebody's taken Dr. Martin dyes and they've colored a photocopy.
That's
and then
exactly right. Yeah.
Call out with a line that will say, this is, C2Y2B. And that would be the, it would never be that one, but let's say C2Y2M. And so that would be 25% cyan, 25% yellow, and then 100% magenta. And then that would be whatever that color worked out to. And so what I was doing was saying, I think I can. So the way that was done originally was you would take, forgive me if I'm going far too into detail on this, but
getting in the weeds. We're getting in the
weeds. The way it was
weeds.
done originally is they would create masks, like cut out masks, and that would hold out against a negative, and then you would take a screen, which is a dot pattern, and you'd put it behind that, and you'd make a negative, and that would be that 25% that I'm talking about. And what that literally meant was 25% of ink coverage in that hole was 25% of whatever you ink you use.
Little dots, yeah, in a
So
closer or further apart, or bigger or smaller. Yep.
And one of the things you had to be careful about is what's called a moire pattern, where they would buzz your eyes. So you would take the 25% would be here, the cyan would be here, the yellow would be 45 degrees, the magenta would be another 45 degrees, and so on. And by doing that, they never buzzed. And so I'm looking at that and going, I think we can kind of fake that by painting shades of gray and shooting halftones. And just like how you would print a black and white photograph in a newspaper back then. And we did a test and it worked incredibly well. And so we started doing that. We started offering that as a service, because up until then, you were literally stuck paying one of two companies out there a lot of money to create these masks. And one of the studios was a company owned by Murphy Anderson, who was a famous comic book.
Right.
And I would always hear that, Murphy had this, their words, not mine, room full of little old ladies sitting there cutting rubelith on, Fantastic Four. But if you look at those old comics, and sometimes a lot of times you'll see that it's out of register, that the colors don't quite line up right, and there's blue outside of Captain America's mask and all that. Sometimes that was just a printing slip, but sometimes it was just because they just did a really sloppy mask.
Some little old lady wasn't seeing very well.
Right.
Forgot her glasses that day. Forgot her glasses that day, yeah.
The Friday afternoon car, right?
Yeah.
Off the assembly line.
Exactly.
It would be tedious.
And was that automated at all, or like in a printing machine that would do it, or would you have to line it up by hand? Or?
All lined up by hand.
Oh, wow.
You are a jack of many trades.
Do that job. I like to joke that I was a stripper in the 90s, because I worked at a printer, and the strippers were the one who stripped red translucent tape to put the negatives in the right place.
Yep.
And those people were called strippers. I did that for about 6 months.
Yeah.
Very tedious work. No, I didn't make a lot of money. And in fact, I was scheduled for a raise at the end of the 6 months, and they laid me off, so they didn't have to pay the raise. That's how nice the company was. But
no poll work.
Yeah, all that stuff is all done by hand.
Yeah.
It's all and they had this one big room that had a huge vacuum plate, had a glass plate that it would fold down. You'd put the artwork on it. They'd put the glass plate on it, suck all the air out between the glass and the art, flip it back, and then it would be taken a picture of by camera at the other end of the room. Mm-hmm. That's how stuff like that was shot. Artwork and everything shot that way.
So I took when I helped start Innovation, we wanted a printer, and so we went to a local printer, and I showed them what I knew. And I said, I think you guys can make our negatives. I think you can do our color separations. And
yes.
I set them up doing that. And then when I joined Caliber Press, we gave them work. So they printed all of our books there for our premium books for a good couple of years. So that, anything we did in color, which Rocky Horror was the first thing we did in color, and then graphic music. And then Gary went on to do a bunch of other stuff.
That's brilliant work. Figuring out you could do that is paint those gray tones. And
I had
that's brilliant.
I had a leg up on it because because I'd been a graphic artist in another world, but I knew who had done it. And so I called up Bill Dubé, who had done it with Richard Corbin, and he sent me a Spirit cover of color separations to look at.
Wow.
And
so you reverse engineered it, didn't you?
Yeah, literally. And he knew what I was doing. He didn't do it anymore. And so if you ever look at Richard Corbin's stuff from the 70s, early 80s, what he did was he would paint a gray image, and then his overlays were all done this way. That's
why that looked like he was painting it. Yeah. Because
very much so. Wow. So all those Spirit covers and the Spirit color sections,
all that color was in here.
Yeah. Well, that was the thing. And my wife and I both were at a point there where, we could just tell you that, that that's 25% cyan, 75% it was. And then when I got into film and TV, and I'm making color calls for visual effects, and I start to do that, and I go, wrong world. So hang on. That's what's called additive color, and in film and TV, you work with subtractive color.
Yeah,
So it's another way of looking, because that's how you calculate RGB, and it's a different one. Yeah. But so in '96, I was doing. We were doing all the support for comic book stuff. I was teaching myself film and TV. Shot a short film. Had interest in it becoming a TV series for USA Network. I was too naive, and my thing was, well, I'm not really trying to sell a show here. I'm just trying to get some feedback because I've never shot anything, and they were saying, it's like, no, it's great. Let's do something. And I kind of got cold feet, and but I started shooting my first feature, and it took me 5 years, and then we sold my movie called Frost: Portrait of a Vampire, and Frost was based on my comic book, and it ended up being the 18th highest grossing direct-to-DVD release of 2003. And because of that, which meant that it was doing it did like 2.7 million in rentals. Because of that, I got greenlit to do another film, and then one more film, and then a deal to do 6 more as one big deal.
Wow.
And where does Bloodshot come in on that?
And not one of them, because Bloodshot was Bloodshot was owned by Valiant and then Acclaim, and then in 2000 I made a deal to sell my visual effects house to a company called Film Roman. Film Roman was the animation company that did King of the Hill and The Simpsons and X-Men Evolution. And I became an employee there and continued to run my visual effects division. They knew I was trying to raise money to make movies. And then they were acquired by a telecom called IDT. And IDT said, we'll fund your films. Let's make movies. This is great. And so we did. And I also said, well, there's this comic book company I used to be a part of that's been languishing in bankruptcy for a while. I'd love to go make them an offer and see if we can make animated movies and TV shows based on this intellectual property. And they gave me permission, and I made a deal with Acclaim to buy the rights to do everything for $25,000 and 10% of the net. And 45 days later, they went bankrupt officially. And all deals in the state of New York were unwound if they were made within the last 60 days prior to bankruptcy. So it sat, and nothing happened. And for years. Don't
you just love getting the rug yanked out from under you? Like it happened to me so many times.
It's why my back is so sore. And
yeah.
But we so in 2012, 2 young fans who I don't think it's unfair to say came from money or had access to money, bought the properties out of bankruptcy. I believe it was $1 million. And then, but just before they did that, another enterprising publisher out there bought the trademarks because they had gone unfiled, unregistered. And prevented them from publishing for a while until they got their money. And so then when they did that, they started publishing, but they didn't really have any money to publish anything because they'd spent it all getting the rights. So it took them a while to kind of get their feet going and get on their feet and do something. And along the way, then they finally got money, ultimately from a Chinese company called DMG, but they decided to publish the line, publish new books based on the old IP. And they were very aggressive going to talent agencies like William Morris and so forth to get to make deals to do film and TV stuff. And they have ultimately sold the rights to Sony for Bloodshot. And but there had been on again, off again Bloodshot attempts for years. In 2000, it was going to be made starring Triple H, the wrestler, and then that went away. And then there was talk of Jared Leto actually being Bloodshot at one point, and then it was just he was going to be in the film, and then he ended up not in the film. But at any rate, it ultimately got made, and I got to go to South Africa and be on set. And I did not get a chance to work on it as a writer or a creator or anything, but I did have feedback and gave them feedback.
And how close did it adhere to the original?
Not.
That's
at one
every single
the word
time.
Bloodshot.
At a certain point, they had redeveloped or relaunched, reinvented, rebooted the character, and they wanted to do it closer to what they had been doing in the new comics. And I'm friends with Dinesh. I think a lot of him and think highly of him. And he was the producer and been a valiant one of those two young men that had bought the rights. And we were standing in South Africa, and he wanted to kind of preface this to me, prep me. It's not exactly your character. That's not the one we're doing. And he said, because it's like yours was really kind of wrapped up in the whole mafia and organized crime thing. And I mean, when's the last time you really saw organized crime as an antagonist in a film or something? I said, outside of John Wick or Daredevil, I can't really think of anything. And he was like, well, yeah, but that's not the mob. It's still organized crime. It doesn't have to be Sicilian mafioso to be organized crime. Russians, it could be Chinese, it could be Americans, Mexican cartel, whatever you want. But they also chose to do the newer character, which is Dwayne Rosinski did a wonderful job rebooting that, and I love his stuff. My thing, and I have to acknowledge that I know intellectually that part of it's just my ego, but part of it is if I'm adapting a comic book to spend 80 million bucks on, I think I'm going to go with the one that sold 1 million copies and not the one that sold 40,000 copies. And that was my logic. But it was great to see them work on it. It was great to see them actually take my feedback and do something with it. So I saw the first cut, and I gave them a lot of, here's what I think, what it's worth. And
the production values were amazing.
Yeah, they did a great job. And a lot of that is by no means just me saying things, but there were, they had pulled back on a lot of the superhero-y stuff initially. I don't know who was pushing for that. And it was kind of, in my mind, I kept hearing Jeff Goldblum say, there will be a superhero in your superhero movie, right? And so they completely redid the ending, and it made it huge, and where it wasn't before, and they initially were not doing anything with him turning white or a glowing chest or any of that stuff, and they did all that stuff. And they had the nanites in there, but not to the scale that we saw later, and all that stuff is based on my book. But it was a great experience. Dinesh flew me and Bob Layton over, and we spent a little less than a week over there on set. And got to meet everybody. We spent some time with Vin, and spent time with, like I said, met pretty much the whole cast. And we didn't get to meet Guy Pearce rather. He had left literally the day before we got there, but we got to see pretty much everybody else.
It sounds like an adventure.
It was 24-hour flight. I had.
Oh my God!
Yeah, two 12-hour flights from here to Paris.
Oh my Lord!
I don't think I've talked to a single creator who's had their IP turned into a Hollywood production that it hasn't been warped in some way.
Well, I think a lot of people. I think there's a prevailing thought or wisdom, whatever you want to say, that because they're two different mediums, you have to make bigger steps to adapt it. I've always said that long before Marvel was successful with what they're doing, that if you can stay as close to the core of why this thing was successful, I think you'll have better luck. And I think that's been borne out when you watch. Especially, I use the Marvel example because they're so common. But when they hit the tone and they hit the heart, I think that they usually end up doing really well.
Yes.
I wonder if the longer form shows now with streaming, Netflix and Amazon and so forth, will give more opportunities to that. Year ago, so we watched with my kids the series of unfortunate events, and they turned 13 books into 25 episodes, I think, and they were done very, very close to the books. And both of my older kids and my wife and I have all read the books, and we were pretty blown away by how close it fits the book. And there's some stuff that doesn't translate from the written page to a screen, of course. So, but that's one of the good examples I know of that they did it, and it was a fantastic series. And my wife's a big Harry Potter book fan. And get her started. If you want to get her started, I just
wind her up.
Oh, hey, what's the difference between the Deathly Hallows book and the movie? And she'll just go on and on about it.
My daughter does that too.
Yeah. That's not how it happened in the book.
I ask her when Gandalf saved Harry.
Exactly. That is an interesting. It's an interesting trade-off, I think, having someone who dreams of my stories reaching the masses, and then them saying, hey, let's make it into a movie.
I'm holding out for the musical.
Yeah, Steam Patriots musical would be great.
Give Hamilton a run for its money.
My big thing was I started making movies, so I ended up doing, I think I've written and directed, edited and produced 7. And a few years ago, I've done visual effects for lots of movies and TV shows, and it's always interesting because I'll be on set on big projects, little ones too, but on big projects where these discussions are being had, and I will always push, if I can, to whatever level I can from my position of what I'm doing, to let's try to be faithful to stuff. Because
that's what made it popular in the first place.
Right.
Well, it's the same old thing.
That's what they're buying, whether they realize it or not.
Sure.
That is, they're buying that, but then they throw away the most important parts, which always kind of blows me away. That all they're buying is the name. It seems
it's kind of like if a video game company were to buy a comic book publisher and then systematically let all the creators go.
Yeah.
That would never happen.
Because after a while, they've gotten rid of all the things that made them successful, and they've just bought them.
Yeah.
Starting
with the guy who started it all. Hey, Brent.
I did what now?
Brent. Brent's joining us. Brent, if you haven't noticed, the venerable Kevin Vanhook is here with us. He has been talking about his career. Kevin, if you want to start over, 1981. He's been.
I was born.
Yeah, he's great tales of becoming an overnight success after toiling for 10 years, and we've been hearing his career and tidbits and nuggets of wisdom as he's been creating stories, both writing and drawing, and moving now into the film industry. And we've been talking about Bloodshot and some of his other films, and watching them take his comic book and turn it into a film, and having it be changed just a teensy weensy bit into a film. Kevin, we are in the last half hour of our show here. You are welcome to continue as you are chronologically with your story. I love hearing about it. I love also some of our fans. We've got people trying to get into the industry. If you don't mind, touch on some just pearls of wisdom for professionalism. And one question I had is you seem to be a very well-rounded individual. Barb started to say, jack of all trades, which has suited you or done you very well. It seems like. What skills do you recommend folks really refine to get on the resume? And I don't mean the literal resume, but just to get in their toolbox to really set themselves just that one notch higher than anybody else to stand out from the crowd. So take that question as you may, but we continue with your career.
No, I can answer that.
Very interesting.
To what degree I can. The big thing is you have to realize that I really do a lot of different things. Mm-hmm. And I know that I'm unusual in that sense. And so I'm actually consulting with a new company called Viziate out of Jakarta, Indonesia, and a new comic book publisher. And I'm writing 3 titles for them. And I'm very excited about where that's going. These guys are a multimedia company. They do visual effects, they do animation, and they really want to tell compelling and entertaining comic book stories. And I find myself, because I normally spend most of my day typically I'm either writing, working on a pilot that I'm pitching for a TV series, or I am creating visual effects for a movie, typically action films, like lots of gunplay and explosions and smoke and that kind of stuff.
The best kind of movies.
I do a lot of that kind of thing. And some are pretty low budget, that meaning, $1 million, $2 million. And then some, I worked as a visual effects supervisor on Project Power with Jamie Foxx and Joseph Gordon-Levitt. That was a Netflix original, and which was like $65-70 million movie. At the end of the day, it's all the same process. You try to write the best story you can. You plan it. Yeah. You cast it. You try to shoot it the best way you can, and then you cry yourself to sleep at night, hopefully trying to make it better in editorial. So the reason I say all that is because if I wanted to be the best Kevin Vanhook, the comic book artist that I began my career as, the best thing I would have done is not done all the other things. And the reason that is because I wasn't able to just focus on it. I say this with all minimal humility that it deserves, but I was really good at like 18, 19 years old. And good enough that Al Williamson wanted me to work for him as an assistant. And I got a cat climbing my back.
That's all right. Doing photo bombing you.
Yeah.
It's a black one too. I have one.
It's a black, jet black. So
right.
It's Cosmo.
This is when he raised
and so, but when I started having to make a living, and because I'd gotten married very young and had responsibilities, I have a very short attention span. I had to learn these other things, and then it served me well in the sense that if the comic book market took a downturn, I would go make money as a graphic artist, or I'd make money as a visual effects guy, or I would be hired to write a screenplay or a teleplay or those kind of things. And if those things weren't playing, then I would write a comic book, or I would draw commissions or those kind of things. And so I can usually, not always, manage to do okay financially during those periods. But it did come with the price that I'm not the draftsman that I would have been if I drew every day. And so if your goal is that you want to be the best artist you can, draw every day, be critical of your work, try to be better than you were on the last thing. Don't settle for less. Yep. Neil Adams was, I never had my portfolio reviewed by Neil Adams. I know that Neil could be notoriously harsh, and I know that some of the people who he trained were particularly harsh to me, in my opinion, cruel. But I did hear stories that he would, ironically, said to one of these people that was cruel to me when he was reviewing his portfolio. He said, "Oh, I see you're still settling." And what he went on to say was, "You're still accepting that first version of that pose that was in your head, as opposed to pushing yourself to draw it differently." Because it really is very easy for most comic book creators, especially people I find from my era, to draw the same face and draw the same body type and the same expressions. And it's because we were influenced by people, I say this with no malice or anything, but John Buscema was brilliant. Sal Buscema was a craftsman. And I felt Sal did some things wonderfully well, but he wasn't the anatomist that John was. And
no, not even close.
He's just not. And it's.
But he was a good storyteller.
I don't mean it in a mean way. It's and it was just real easy to see as I was starting to learn how you could become more like Sal than John. And it was that there was a level of talent that John had on top of this wonderful skill that he had as well. And if any of you guys have ever seen an original page by John, the back of it was more than likely covered with sketches. And it's because he drew constantly and he pushed himself. He didn't draw the same figure of Spider-Man standing like this. He drew a pirate, being knocked on his butt, or he drew Conan, standing there holding a woman, or he drew a horse with nostrils flaring. And it was every page was that. And so I would say that if you're going to whether it's writing, whether it's drawing, push yourself, show your work to people who have done what you do. Editors are important to get their opinions because they can give out work, but editors oftentimes, I've sat in portfolio reviews or around portfolio reviews and heard the same knee-jerk list, and they don't really necessarily understand what they're saying as much as they're saying things that they've heard art directors and people who did know what they were saying.
Yep.
Like,
yeah,
well, you really need to work on your foreshortening and your perspective and your storytelling. And if you were to ever say, "What do you mean by that specifically?" they would go, "Well, there's a wealth of information out there on the internet." And
it sounded cool when you were saying it.
Yeah. But if you show it to somebody, like over the years, if you had shown a portfolio to someone who would be willing to give you the time, that knew what they were doing, you would get immeasurably valuable feedback.
So, and I get this, I get the impression, and correct me if I'm wrong, play well with others seems to be a great, I feel like a theme, because I mean, you mentioned names that Barb knows, that Rob knows, that Aaron knows, and that especially in the comics world, in the industry, and I'm very new to the industry, and actually having a comic book, in the conventions that I attend, people say, "Oh, I know so and so who worked on such and such," and they'll either have a good thing to say or a bad thing to say usually. And from what I'm gathering, is really not so much in the way of leveraging your contacts, but play well with others.
Well, definitely. Yeah, I mean, you want to, you definitely want to show up, be on time,
be professional,
deliver the thing that they thought they were buying. Because one of the toughest things for me as a young artist was my portfolio was better than my work. And that's because when I'm drawing for myself, there was no pressure and I had more time and all that stuff. And I'm talking about, I was less than 20 years old, this era that I'm talking about. But that was one of those things I had to learn.
Yeah, I said the same thing. I've never missed a deadline, ever. I've always been nice to people on my way up, because on my way down, they may be in a position of power. So you never want to step on somebody on your way up the ladder, because as you're coming down the ladder, they're going up.
Have you ever heard Wally Wood's story about that?
You reserved all that for me, didn't you, Barbara?
Oh, yeah.
She's been stepping on me forever.
Got all those footprints, Barb's footprints up here.
Yeah, I know. I'm taking one for the team.
So supposedly the story was that Marv Wolfman and Lynn Wein at a certain point basically said, we're not giving work to Wood. And when asked about it, it turned out that they used to show him their work and talk to him at conventions and so forth. And he was quite rude. And his running phrase was, never piss on your fans, son. You never know when they're going to be signing your checks. And, I had the privilege of working with Dan Atkins. So one of the things that happened that was a positive with me working with Innovation, I initially was drawing a book that Tim Truman had co-created and had started, and called Newstralia. And I initially had an inker that I felt, to be fair to him, I probably wasn't giving him everything he needed, but for me at that age, I felt like he was inking my backgrounds with an eraser. And so I ended up having a choice of who I could get. And I went to Dave and I said, if I can get Dan Atkins for a rate that works, how would you're cool. It's like, I've always heard he's flaky. And it's like, if I can get Dan Atkins to work and his rate works, are you willing to let me hire Dan? And so my wife and I drove to meet Dan Atkins, and he became a mentor and a friend, and he inked me for a few of those issues. And so here was the guy who had inked, just to put it in perspective so people know if they don't know who he was. He had been an art director at Marvel, but he had inked Barry Windsor Smith on the early Conan stuff. He had inked John Buscema on Silver Surfer. So classic, beautiful stuff. He had been a Wally Wood assistant. Mm-hmm. And his problem was he would much rather prefer spending his time listening to his stereo than he was literally a hi-fi nut. So when I went to his place, his little attic room was all covered in eggshell and like styrofoam stuff. Egg cartons to cut down on the reflected sound. But he was jaded about the business, but he could draw, he could ink, and so he was a funny guy, but he taught me a lot because I would show him my stuff and he would be a little insulting at first, and I would kind of push back and then he would go, it's like, no, this is good, you just don't know how to do this yet. And just little things that I still find myself showing to people. Sorry for the lighting here, but
that's all right. You're on the West Coast, right?
Yeah, the sun decided I need a kicker. So.
Yeah, I've got no sun here, so.
But this one never goes away. But he would show me things like, penciling or inking folds in fabric that, I was putting an even space between the wrinkles. And he said, that doesn't happen in real life. Why are you doing it? And it's like, well, I just never thought about it. And it's like, and then realizing, okay, if I vary the width and length and boldness of these strokes, or when I was inking and I was showing him my stuff, he would say, that's a pen thing. That's not a brush thing. Stop doing that, and my work escalated enormously during that time period.
Trees got to be done with a pen.
Yeah. And I was using, the same kind of tools. So I was using, Hunt 102s and Gillette 1970s and all this kind of stuff. And of course, a Winsor Newton Series 7, number 2 and number 3.
Before they became
when they were still good.
Now the Raphael's 8404s is what I use.
That's what I hear that is the common replacement these days.
Yeah, we had for everybody out there, last week's episode, we had a great conversation with Barb, and Rob chimed in, of course, and all of our artists about coloring and so forth, and we got into coloring and the tricks of the trade.
As we're my area. That's what I'm doing. I'm doing coloring, which I'm not really I'm not really sure why. But I'd be more than happy to show you. I color very differently than everyone else on here, so it would be very different for you guys.
Yeah. Wait, Aaron, that's kind of like an understatement. That's like the understatement. I do fill in the blank very differently than everybody else on here. I
try. I mean, I try to do everything differently. Somebody tells me what to do, I'm like, that's stupid. I'll do it this way, and
do it my own way.
Yeah. Well, the clock's ticking down here on the last few minutes, and so I wanted to go briefly, or we can wrap up however it wraps up. This has been a great conversation. I love it, but industry, like if you've got some sort of just something you got to get off your chest, or or what does the indie comic world need to do that you see they're not doing? What is the film industry or just the basic storytelling? Are there too many cliches out there? What in Kevin Vanhook's perfect world?
In all honesty, I don't look at things that way.
Okay.
So it's just philosophically, it's not how I think. I don't look in terms of, the kids who are on my lawn doing horrible comments.
Back in my day,
it's just not how I look at things. So, but I think that I will say that I found it fascinating when I was doing some stuff for DC. I'm going to try to lose the sun. There we go.
Yeah.
Sort of. When I was doing some stuff for DC a few years back, I was writing Oracle, the Cure, which is the character that had been Batgirl, had become Oracle, and the idea was story part of Night of the Cowl, and the idea was that coming out of the story, she would be cured and she'd be able to walk. And I wrote the story. I was very proud of it, and I wrote full script. And I opened up the first page with a cutaway view of a tenement apartment building, where on the top floor you see a silhouetted figure seated. You can't really quite tell what they're doing, and then the next floor down you see a kid playing a video game or holding video game controllers, but the TV's off and the mother's shouting. Next panel down you see, which is the next floor down, you saw a couple arguing. And what it was is the electricity had gone out in the building, and everybody's complaining about each other. It's like, it's because you run your stupid hairdryer, It's like, you and your video games, you done messed up the whole building. Yeah. And running down the sides of the page was an answering machine. Hey Babs, do me a favor, call me back. And it was Dick Grayson calling. It was another one of her friends. So this is all happening. And then the last one down, the last little answering machine thing was, hey honey, it's Daddy, I'll be there in a few minutes, looking forward to tonight. And then you turn the page and she says, Daddy, crap. And she's forgotten, and she's sitting there, and she's yanked all the electricity, all the big cables out of the wall, and she's trying to rewire things so she can have enough power to do all of her computer equipment stuff. And now she has to go take a shower and get cleaned up because Commissioner Gordon's going to be there in a minute. But what was fun about that was saying, okay, I could do this 1,000 different ways, but why don't I do something kind of Rear Window-like, do something where we see different people's lives and how our character is affecting them, and do it as a punchline, as a reveal, so that when you get to that full page splash on the next thing, now we realize, oh, it's her, and she's the one that's caused this problem, and she's the reason the electricity's out, and all that stuff. And what I found fascinating was that I did I don't know, 11 years ago, maybe 12 years ago, and I still get Twitter comments about that. And when I went to DC to talk to him about doing Martian Manhunter a few years ago, the guy who was basically the editor-in-chief was like, just in the middle of the conversation, it's like, yeah, none of our writers know how to do that stuff. And I'm like, I'm sure they know how to do that stuff. And he's like, no, they don't know how to do that stuff. And he said, I have to yell at them to make sure that they list the characters' names in the comic book so people will know who these characters are. And I said, yeah, I've had to do that as an editor myself, because that's extremely important to make sure everybody understands who we're dealing with, because every comic book is somebody's first.
Yeah,
that's it. Yep.
You have to look that way. And there was a reason that Marvel started putting Bitten by a Radioactive Spider, Peter Parker, blah, 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 at the top of page 1. And then around the time I stopped reading comics, my understanding is they did a full page 1 that would give even more backstory and stuff.
Previously on.
But it was but anyway, my point being, those kinds of things that are craft. With this group I'm working with out of Indonesia, I'm teaching some young, very, very wonderfully talented young people, but the basic tenets of things like balloon placement. And because a lot of people don't think about the fact that the pointer should point at the mouths of the person that is speaking.
Right.
And it's surprisingly not common to do it right. And it's not acceptable to put the person on our right speaking first, and the person on the left over here with a balloon that crosses somehow to deal with that.
We talked about that two episodes ago.
Yes, we
you
did.
Have to be careful. You have to be careful about where you put the people.
Well, and that was the beauty of. I mean, it can work if you're writing full script, because if the artist follows what you wrote, then when I'm writing it, I've got the correct character on the saying it on the left side. They know where the word balloon's going to be. They can put that character on the left. But as we did all the Valiant stuff plot first, so it would be, here's the plot. It's the description of each panel, but there's no dialogue. I might give you a couple of lines to just get you the feel of it. But it wasn't until those pencils are coming back to me that I would actually literally dialogue it and do my own balloon placements with a Sharpie. And the advantage of writing plot first is if they don't draw what I wrote, I have a chance to fix my writing later and make it clear, because now I'm writing the final lettering, what's going to be lettered. So.
It's funny. I almost think the balloon thing that reading a lot of manga, I started noticing they didn't do balloon tails. The characters. There's been, and I don't know why that is. Like they'll put like, it's almost like they draw the pictures and they put the balloon placement reading. I mean, they read right to left.
Correct.
But there's sometimes and for some reason you kind of get it. You figure out who's talking. But I did notice if there was any sort of tail, it was just a simple line, maybe pointing to a guy's mouth. But they rarely did that. And I wonder if the people you're working with were used to seeing that. And maybe this in American comics, there is more of a tail of a balloon. And they're like, oh, I never thought of that. I wonder if
people I'm dealing with specifically that are dealing with the lettering are people that really didn't come out of comics. They didn't. Really
okay. All right. Well, that makes sense. Yeah.
But in manga, you'll still, if you look at it closely, you'll still see that it's coming from. It's still laid out in logical.
Yeah, it is.
Right to left and so forth. And I know what you mean. The balloon tail balloons.
Yeah, not as much. I always thought that was kind of interesting. But yeah, I did notice that.
I'll tell you one interesting little anecdote. I was doing balloon placements and dialoguing Eternal Warrior on a subway, on a PATH train from Jersey City into New York. And this guy, so it's 8:30 in the morning, and he's standing there rocking and holding the strap. And he looks down and says, "That's Eternal Warrior." That means you're Kevin Vanhook. Yep. Said, oh, that's so cool. And he turned out he was a painter, and named James Brown. And I invited him to come by, and he ended up coloring some books for us. So,
that's cool.
Probably enough to call him the hardest working.
Things work out like that, yeah.
Yeah.
Huh.
But yeah, just what are the odds that somebody's gonna do that? It was at a time period where we were selling a lot of copies, so it was, and New York is a very comic book friendly place. But one of my greatest experiences was I had a buddy of mine in from Kentucky visiting, and we hit right in Midtown in Herald Square, where there were comic book dealers out on the sidewalk at night. And to be fair, I had a Valiant jacket that actually had my name Kevin right here. But but I was standing there looking at books. My buddy's there, and I said, "How much you got on this one?" I held up some miscellaneous comic book, and he said, 50% off of whatever it says for you, Mr. Vanhook. But he obviously knew our books, but it made me huge points with my buddy from high school. So.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, Kevin, we are at 9:30 here on the East Coast, and this is where we wrap up. Before we go, I want to thank Daytona Beach Comic Convention. It's coming up September 10th and 11th. Thank you for all your support for Silverline. We got Brent Larson here, who hasn't gotten to chime in next week. Right. Brent Larson, Kalis in Cape Town, Rory Boyle over there, Steam Patriots, Twilight Grimm, Rob Davis, and everything else, Barb Cowbird, Divinity, Aaron Humphreys, Obsoletes. Mr. Kevin Vanhook, this has been a fantastic hour and a half. I've loved it. You are welcome back anytime, and we will continue the conversation next to a weekend. If you're anywhere near Pittsburgh, come see Rory, me, and Roland. We got Silverline going on. This has been a great evening, and we always wrap up saying, make mine Silverline. It's been great. We'll see you next week. All right. Good night, everybody.
Take care. Thanks, Barb. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it. Thank you, Kevin. It's awesome.
Hi, I'm Greg Horn. Make mine Silverline.